So, welcome everybody to the Tech Hour. This is Thursday, the 7th of April, 2022. And there's four of us here, myself, Nelson Beebe, Kelly Johnson, and Abbas Jaffary. And I'm going to start sharing the screen and talk a little bit about an accessibility problem that Jason White reported on the TUG accessibility list. So I've put does that show itself well on the screen, on your screens? Yeah. Would you like it a little larger? Yeah. So one of the things I got from this actually is things might work in theory, but you've got to test it with the practitioners and the people who are closer to the users throw up things that you just don't think about. And what it is that browsers don't recognize a table if it doesn't have heading elements. They think it's there just for layout. And so you don't get the table navigation that you would otherwise want with the screen reader. If you can't see the table, then you have to navigate the table. And that navigation is a big part of it. And he asked the question, is there a way, a generally accepted LaTeX convention for specifying which cells in a table are header cells? Which is a really nicely put question. I think he's done us a great favor by asking that question there. And he's using Lwarp, which for those people that don't know, there are two big architectures for getting HTML from tech or from LaTeX. The one is to use the LaTeX source, which has to have some rigor to it so that you can parse it. And the other is to use a modified typesetting situation where you typeset the stuff, and in the course of typesetting it, you insert all the tags. And then your HTML is essentially typeset, and you strip out the sort of typeset formatting, and that gives you your HTML. So you write the tags to the output pages, and then you read them without the page breaks or anything. So I was intrigued by this, and to go back to something that Abbas asked about before the recording started, how does tagged PDF fit into all of this, the work the LaTeX project is up to? Well, the LaTeX project wants to do the same thing that Lwarp is doing, but they want PDF output that is good for the sighted reader at the same time. So they have invisible tags in the typeset output for the screen reader and visible text for the sighted people. So they've got a harder problem than the Lwarp problem, essentially. And I had a look at Lwarp, and I also had a go at solving the problem. So I've suggested as a syntax, you simply have a command called head row that will deal with the simplest tables. The simplest tables has one row that is the headings: name, age, salary, or whatever it is. And that makes it easy to get the PDF output because you essentially make the head row a null-op. It just doesn't do anything. And so you don't change the output by putting that markup there, but it does allow you to get Lwarp to do something, because Lwarp runs the same LaTeX file, but with different definitions for the macros. And I did a hack on the macros, and I got this output here, which is quite interesting. So the head row has TD, all the cells in the table have got TDs, but the tag for them as the tagging. But for the head row, I have one and two halves mangled names, AAATD, and that's simply my proof that I can control what's going on into that tag name. So the fact that it's wrong doesn't matter. The important thing is I have an opportunity to change what's going there and get the right thing out. And there's this timing problem, which is the first tag starts with a TD and it should start with something else. The first tag in the head row starts with a TD and it should start with something else. And the last tag in the head row finishes with a TD and it should finish with something else. So I'm not getting access to those things to mangle the output to give what we want. And I contacted Brian Dunn and he says, well, the table stuff, the tabular stuff, is actually the most complicated thing in Lwarp, and I have to do some look ahead. And maybe to get this problem solved, you're going to have to look ahead a bit more. And that's about as far as we've got to so far. As I said, the tagging project that the LaTeX 3 projects are doing will have to solve this problem. What's happening, if we scroll back, if we look at this table, the Lwarp system is saying, oh, we've begun a tabular, and the first thing in the tabular will be a table data. So I'll write down a table data, but that's wrong. It might be a head data. That's what we really should be having. So it has to look ahead to see that it's a head row and then change what it does. And all this is being done not through a regular text parser, but through in the midst of a typesetting system. So I think this is really interesting. And I think that Jason has done us all a great big favor by raising this question and asking for a solution. And I'm very impressed by the way in which he's formulated everything. So he's helped point us in the right direction. So we've got roughly the right HTML. And here are the macros for what they're worth. It's simply intercepting what normally happens and make it do something else. And then when you get back to the end again, restore the previous state. So that's pretty much what any tech hacker would do. So at that point, maybe I'll stop sharing. And we can have a discussion from that. And it would be good if Abbas could perhaps introduce himself and talk about his accessibility interests. Would that be good?
Yeah, thank you. So I came into it from teaching, and I had written some materials that I wanted to transfer over into a more accessible screen readable format. And as I started exploring that, I realized all the nuances and workflow necessary to do that. So I realized that going straight from TeX files into screen readable formats was not quite there. It didn't exist. And what subtle things I've read says the internal data structure of a TeX file, it doesn't really have data structures. It's mostly just a bunch of strings. And then the PDF output, right, is just essentially meant for presentation. So it doesn't generate any sort of tagged PDF on its end. It's just meant for printing and presentation there. So all the approaches from taking any sort of TeX markup into screen readable is really just trying to isolate the mathematical components, right, between delimiters, and then something like Pandoc or MathJax or the other different converters will take essentially the surrounding text. They say, just put it in a markdown file or a document file, a Word doc file or something. That just gets converted to regular HTML paragraphs and whatnot. And then the actual mathematics code, the markup, two things happen. One is it converts it to MathML for the purpose of displaying it in a browser, and then it uses the TeX markup internally, MathJax does, with the MathJax speech rule engine to convert it to alt text and ARIA labels so that the screen reader will read it. So essentially everything is then being just read as an HTML file. And then of course, in the process of this, which I just learned from this Mr. White's post was, okay, part of that conversion is tables, right? LaTeX tables are really not being converted properly. And in fact, what I ended up doing was I had an example where I did have a LaTeX table converted, and then I think I just went in and manually changed, the headers. And then I said, okay, now here I have an HTML template, so there we go. But in terms of fully porting LaTeX files themselves, there is, I came across something called latex.js, which is an app now, which will take a full text file and just make it into essentially a formatted HTML file that looks just like a regular LaTeX document. It's very interesting, and I'll put some links in the chat in a second here. And there's a separate project called the LaTeX CSS project, which is just essentially a CSS file, which will format your LaTeX document into an HTML document, but it'll look just like a LaTeX output. So there are various different layers of work that people are doing to try to get a text file ported over into HTML so that it can be screen readable and presented on the web. But the nuances of taking the actual internal, the main thing is the conversions between just raw LaTeX to another format, say HTML, they're happening, but because of the internal structure of a LaTeX file being sort of not very well structured in terms of its data structures, I guess. That's what I've read multiple places. People are having to put those, just sort of manually find like strings of LaTeX and then interpret what they are into HTML. And then we enter into tag PDF, which sort of does away with this whole necessity anyway, which I think would be, I don't know why that hasn't happened and why that's not a robust option yet. Adobe themselves, they have a formula tag that goes into a tag PDF, and Adobe themselves suggests just generating SVG images and then putting alt text behind something. And I don't know how that, excuse me, I don't know how well that would apply to a table. I don't think it makes any sense to have, for example, an SVG of a table and then alt text the entire table. That's just silly. At the same time, if you have a table, it would be kind of silly to have a bunch of SVGs inside the table representing the math and then having alt text behind the math. I haven't played with that myself. I just rendered it as, as just MathML. So, and I don't know how much effort Adobe is really putting in to trying to get math into tag PDF. I know some of the work that was done by the LaTeX 3 group was funded by Adobe, but I've searched around and they don't really seem to have like a working group themselves on it, which I find strange. So that the effort here that could be done into porting this table, I think there's room to have it both ways, to have it done, again, one into HTML, but then also that same work could potentially work its way into a tag PDF, because they're really just both doing the same thing. And then there is a really good, I think it's called Prince, is a software that is really just working to convert between HTML and tag PDF. And I will find links for you for all of this stuff. This is all stuff I've discovered in the last month.
Okay, I know about Prince with the Z, and it looks quite good. I didn't know it produced tag PDF. It's commercial, proprietary PDF generating system.
Okay.
I think you can use it for free, but it watermarks the page with its brand so that you can't use it commercially.
Okay.
I'd like to take a small diversion, which is to ask me not what your sources of sort of what your sources of information are. So did you, for example, learn about this meeting from the accessibility list on the TUG website?
Yes, I believe so. I'm positive that's where it was from, because I went to the MathML list as well, and then there's a couple other work group lists. So most likely from TUG is where I found this.
Right. And do you have? There's a whole group of people. Most US universities have an Office of Disabled Student Services, I think it's called, and there they have experts who are usually students trained up to help their disabled students. So that's one big whole area of it. And then you've got people like the LaTeX 3 project who are coming from the typesetting point of view. And then there's a whole group, if you like, around Pandoc.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then there's MathJax. And there's some people you may not know. They produce a software called Pretext, which is an XML system. You've heard of that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And around, there's people around Volkersorge who are a sort of software people in academia who are out to, so to speak, provide technically strong solutions. And there's a wide range of skills, and there's also the visually impaired programmers list, and they're not particularly focused on mathematics, and they're more people in the world of work rather than the world of education.
Okay.
So there's a lot of people and a lot of different skills, and I'm forming the view that there's not a sort of single place where people gather to exchange information. It may be that it's impossible that there'd be such a place,
mm-hmm.
but sort of, I feel as though there's a lack of commonality or community that community could be developed further. So that's just on the side. So I'm actually quite interested in having a conversation with you or other people that sort of explains what's going on with the basis of producing a collection of resources. The stuff on the TUG website, the resources on the TUG website are very heavily focused on tagged PDF. And for example, have very little awareness or reference to user experience. Whereas in the blind math, you maybe have a mother whose child is starting high school or going through high school who wants advice on how that child can succeed or not succeed. So there's this enormous wide range of stuff, and to get everything to work, to make the best result, we've got to communicate with each other appropriately without boring each other, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll try and stop at that point.
Yeah, could I interject something here? You know, technical books and papers tend to be full of tables, and because most human languages have a right to left or left to right reading direction rather than a vertical one, most tables in modern science are viewed as something that you read horizontally. For example, a table of chemical compounds with various properties marching across the columns would be read with one particular chemical and then looking at its property values. But if you say, well, what if that table were a census table that has, for example, countries, areas, and populations, there it might be much more interesting for the reader to look down the columns to see what's the biggest country and population or area, what's the smallest, and so on. And the problem with our table markup in both HTML and in LaTeX and in plain text with H-align and V-align is that we don't really have any clear indication of how to navigate that table. It's just assumed that a sighted person could look at it and figure out what to do. But as soon as you ask an unsighted person to look at that table, they really do need control over the writing direction, the speaking directions from the text-to-speech system. And it's not clear to me that that has even been addressed in any markup system.
Well, I think this is something where the people who have visual impairments are very much the experts. And this is something I'm beginning to get some sense of, which is that there's a cognitive burden involved with reading. And if you're sighted, your eyes flick around to remind yourself of something. And that allows the piece of paper to sort of, so to speak, reduce that cognitive burden. So you just sort of glance at something and it reminds you in your mind and whatever. Whereas if you're visually impaired or blind, then you have to take much more care about what your cognitive burden is. And the methods of navigation become much more important. And I suspect that for somebody who's visually impaired, the use of the keyboard is quite good for sort of bringing up the reminder of whatever it is you're looking at. I know that when I'm doing repetitive things at the command line, I use the command completion and the Control R to search through the history. And that's reducing the cognitive burden. And I can perhaps see similar things working there. But if you like, that's a matter for the human-computer interaction people working, and the support people working with the disabled people, to know what sort of gadgets, if you like, work the best. And what is going to be best of all, I think, is if the rendering or audio rendering front end is somewhat decoupled, becomes a separate component that the people who have visual disabilities control for their own purposes. And we might think that we don't have visual disabilities, but if we're driving the car, then we can't look at the map, and that's a visual disability. So we rely on satellite navigation, which is an audio interface largely, although you do get maps coming in. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there. And in a certain sense, our job as part of a document production system is to make sure that the right data is recorded. And a part of that is the tagging markup. And that the person creating the stuff is confident that it's right. So they have to get feedback about it. And then to ensure that that information travels safely through the whole system. So in a certain sense, if you've captured the information correctly to begin with, then the job is to make sure that that information goes through the whole system correctly. And the problem I've got, and Jason White have with the tables, is that there are two ways of saying when a cell begins. The one is the cell begins when we need a cell, which is the current thing that Lwarp does. And the other thing is to say the cell begins where there's some content. And in some sense, we have to wait until the content before we decide what to do with it, because we don't know until we know whether the content is a head or not, whether it should be a TD or a table data or table head. So in a sense, the big difference between TeX and HTML, well, one big difference is that with TeX, you have lots and lots of words, and that includes LaTeX. You have lots and lots of words, and you have bits of markup between, sort of scattered around amongst the words. Whereas with HTML, you have lots and lots of tags, and these tags are populated with text. So you never, in proper HTML, you never get text which is, so to speak, free floating without having some clear context. And without that context being told before the thing starts. So you never, it's almost as if you can't speak without being introduced in HTML. And here is a table data. And here is some strong text. And here is some italic text. And here is some mathematics. All these things have to be explicitly introduced, which is a pain for the author, because the author knows what he means. But it's a great benefit further down. There are two big approaches to getting stuff out of LaTeX. The one is, you see, authors like to write macros, and I'm an author and I like to write macros, but LaTeX is the only system that understands LaTeX macros. So you allow authors to write macros, and then you use LaTeX to process the macros. But that makes the LaTeX file unreadable by any other system. Or the alternative is to make sure that the LaTeX file is readable by other systems, which is what latex.js is doing, is putting constraints on it. And then you've got problems with authors not liking it, and you've got to translate it for LaTeX for typesetting. It's a sort of political, you know, one people, somebody wants to speak French and somebody wants to speak German. We're not going to get anywhere unless we sort of produce translators, if you like. Sorry, I think I've gone on for a bit. Let me pause for a moment and let other people talk. You're muted, Nelson.
Sorry, I'd like to pose a question to Kelly because she has a lot of experience with R Markdown. Kelly, when you deal with tabular material, which I'm sure you have a great deal of, does R Markdown have any particular notation to indicate the difference between the headers of tables and the rows of data?
Good question.
Is the question for the tagged output that's generated, or just any output? So like PDF specific, or say, because R Markdown can also create HTML.
You know, I'm thinking of the input. So you as an author sitting there typing in a table of biological data, is there a distinction? Because the issue is in plain text and LaTeX, there really never has been a distinction between headers of tables and the data rows themselves. And also, we haven't even touched on the issue of tables that have multi-column, either horizontally or multi-row blocks in them to make life even more complicated.
Yeah, those multi-column headers are pretty terrible, and they're being used more and more to make like infographics, they call them, and to make pretty tables. And people think that they're doing a really good thing, but then they're doing a disservice to those that use screen readers, because it makes the table even more I can't think of the word, but comprehensible by the screen reader. So to answer your question, as far as the headers in R Markdown, you can specify your column names to be a header, but in the end, it's not delineated. So in the actual text file that's created, nothing is marked as being a header or just a regular cell table, but there really is no such thing, because in a PDF it ends up just being this thing that's like called a table with a big X through it. But I would say in our data structures, we definitely have data structure where the headers are quote unquote names and the rest are data.
So that's a bit like a CSV file where you have a CSV file starts with table column headings.
And not
Typically,
so much because the column headings are actually data. You just you think that they're headings, but in all reality, they can, you know, be sorted to within your data, where the naming structure of an object inside R is very different from the data that exist. It's two separate entities, but they're linked together via their position.
I'm realizing that tables are well worth putting some effort into.
I would say that the effort that's been put in to make a tagged PDF automatic for every other aspect than tables is pretty phenomenal. And then you get to tables and they're just really complicated, and people are making more and more complicated tables as time goes on. And even the simple ones are not translated yet to tagged markup.
Yeah, tables are sort of ubiquitous in a way that mathematics unfortunately isn't. And a tagged PDF that's got a table in it sort of loses its accessibility fairly easily. I'd like to change the subject a little bit because
before you do that, Jonathan, I have a proposal for Nelson regarding a comment that you made earlier on the tables versus in reading them left to right versus reading them up and down, however you would call that. I think that it is a choice that's made without actually putting in code to do it, because if you wanted the table to be read up and down, you would make you'd make it wide. You'd like reformat the page, and you would actually have what would be in a row across the columns at the top. So users make conscious choices in how they want their table to be read just by how they structure it to begin with, because everybody assumes that you go from left to right. So I think that the option is there, you know, to switch it around if you want to. And so people are making choices on the onset, I think.
Yeah, I noticed that Paulo Ney de Souza, my old friend from Berkeley, has joined us here, and he has a lot of experience in commercial and academic journal production. And I wonder whether he can toss in his views on the table problem.
I want to come in here as host and say that I encourage Paulo to arrive because of a different interest he has, which is that he is involved in the publication of the Proceedings of the International Congress of Mathematicians. Mm-hmm. And and I want to give him the opportunity to contribute to what I've said. The International Congress of Mathematicians takes place every 4 years, and they award the top prize in mathematics there. And it's a completely virtual conference this year because it had been scheduled to take place in St. Petersburg, Russia. So they've had a completely virtual conference, and they're going to hold the ceremonies in Helsinki, I think, which is nearby. And the organisers are working hard to develop the digital infrastructure for the Virtual International Congress of Mathematicians, which also has a lot of satellite or splinter groups where people in particular areas get together. And I think that this is something the tech community might want to get involved in or learn about. And that's why I suggested that Paulo come today. And he's almost a special guest. So over to you, Paulo. Be as special as you want to be.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you for the kind words. No, I mean, I guess, you know, the problem is is huge, especially right now that this hit us in the end of February, the war, cancellation of the ICM, which is right at the time of the production of the proceedings. I don't know if you know that, but there are not. There is, if you attend, meetings in physics and biology and astronomy, you're pretty much supposed to find the proceedings when you get to the meeting. Mathematics has never been like that, almost never. You go to the meeting, you attend the meeting, and 2 years later you see the proceedings of the meeting. Except for the International Congress lately. The International Congress, ICM has made, the IMU has made a point of having several pieces of the proceedings ready by the first day of the Congress. By several pieces of the proceedings, I mean everything else except for the Fields medalists, which are only announced on the first day of the Congress. Fields medalists are being chosen right now, and but they will be announced only on the first day of the Congress, and as such, their talks, as well as the talks about their work, are going to be public only at the first day, so it's impossible to get that part of the proceedings ready. And what's considered to be the volume 1 is made available later. That imposes a very tall order on getting those proceedings out, because the time is very short, and the proceedings have grown to a total of about 6,000 pages at the ICM in Rio. And I would suspect the one in Russia would have been bigger than the one in Rio. So it's literally 6,000 pages, a lot of international work, a lot of non-English speaking papers which are coming from non-English speaking mathematicians to be put together and to be added, reviewed in a short time frame of about 90 days, because the proposed schedule of the IMU is that this paper should be all ready by December 1st of the year, which gives you a total of about 5 months, 6 months. But in general, they aren't. You can imagine that the crowd is a very busy crowd, people which are winning Fields medals and so forth. So they're extremely busy with some other stuff besides writing the paper that's going to appear in the proceedings. And sometimes lots of those papers arrive late. Late February is norm. And among several of the things that we have done, both of the proceedings in Berkeley in the 80s and the proceedings in Rio 4 years ago. So that leaves a very short period. I mean, you want to make those papers feel that they are part of a proceedings. You want to make, you don't want to, somebody using Blackboard bold R for real numbers on paper 1 and just normal R on the second paper and just slanted R on the third paper. You want to, have some normalcy so that people can flip through and have an impression that that those are part of a collection, and that is not easy to be done in this short space of time. So what we have done in Rio is we assemble a body of mathematicians to do the work, and it was sort of hard to get it done. We got it done, just like a notch before, and in fact, in Rio, you could flip through the proceedings and you could have the electronic book available, and it was all done. I think that this time around, things probably are going to be much harder because of the interruptions, with the war and the changes in the schedule right at the end of February. But do you have any specific questions, Jonathan?
I first of all should apologize because I should realize that there's a world of difference between the people meeting each other at the conference and the production of the proceedings. And for somebody who's ignorant, which is what I am in terms of ICMs, anybody that knows anything is a complete expert. I'm the COVID pandemic, followed now by this disruption due to the horrible war in Ukraine, has put a big focus on remote participation, remote conferencing. Zoom has done very well out of all of this, remote working from home, all sorts of things have been accelerated. And to take a really crude example, the Beamer class started as a class for, the predecessor was, I think, a slides class for printing transparencies for an overhead projector on a laser printer. I know, I've done that. Previously, you had an overhead projector and you actually wrote on a piece of film, and I've done that. But if the people are not in the same room, then the idea that your talk is going to be projected on a beamer to go onto a screen no longer applies. And what you really want is to have shared web pages. So you have one person is giving a talk on a web page, and anybody else can follow the web page. So it will be sort of the same age. So what I'm saying is, in condensed form, what I'm saying is that we're no longer sitting in a common room around a blackboard with a piece of paper for our mathematical conversations. We're having mathematical conversations at long distance, and the usual paradigm of typesetting and printing and getting preprints sent in the mail, that went away a long time ago. So the ICM, the participants of the ICM have this problem of having a mathematical virtual meeting. And I think it's something that the tech community must have a big interest in. I went to a summer school remotely last year, and I found that some of the best presentations were given by somebody who was writing on a tablet. And he was probably in his 30s, I think, which is an entirely different model of mathematical communication to what we're accustomed to. So I was wondering, perhaps much too optimistically, because you're really a typesetter, Paulo, as to what are the problems of the digital infrastructure required for a large conference that's mathematical when it's a virtual conference?
Well, yes.
If you've got any special insight there, or just any ideas at all?
Well, I mean, it is a virtual conference. Most likely it's going to be the largest virtual conference in the world so far. Most likely. Really? There are a few open source conferences that sort of got close to the numbers of the ICM, but the ICM will probably be the largest, virtual meeting ever held. And the number of attendees in Rio were between 6,000 and 8,000, and these numbers in Moscow were supposed to be much bigger. Our tech conference, the tech conference, have multiplied by 10 in attendance. after we went virtual. I mean, you just open it up to a much broader set of people that couldn't travel, people that don't want to travel, people which are impossibility to travel, people which, you know, don't have the funds to attend the meeting, and they now can. You know, it just takes a phone or, you know, a little computer to attend. So I think that the fact that it's just a virtual conference makes things a little bit more complex in certain ways. I think that it also introduces a little bit of a disconnect. You know, if you are in the same room with people, you have the opportunity to talk to the speaker after the speaker is finished. So there is, if you're able to talk to the speaker, you know, at the hors d'oeuvre, you know, after the talk, or at some party late at night, it creates the ambience of a conference and creates a connecting between people. So the virtual world, you know, this introduces a sort of a disconnect, and having this material ready, you know, like going back to the proceedings, you know, having all these papers, you know, typeset available on your phone, on your iPad, or whatever you want to read, it's paramount, because that is going to be the connection. That's going to be where people are going to go if they have any questions about the lecture, if they haven't understood a sort of piece of the lecture, or if they want more details, or whatever. So it's imperative that this to be produced in very high standards, so that is sort of the sewing that provides the connection among everybody, because online parties are not good. They're not. They do not provide any interaction that I find meaningful. We have tried that at Doug, and the experience is not as good as being able to attend a lecture. There's a clear advantage. You can you know, not invest any money whatsoever, be on the other quarters of the world and attend a lecture. That is amazing. But you know, the fact that you can't really progress any further in your interaction with the speaker in any way is also is very troubling for this model. And I think you know, to be able to flip through this material and go deeper in the particular subject using the proceedings is paramount. You touched a subject which is to be able to sort of display material appropriately during the lecture. Of course, that depends on each individual. You know, if he's going to pre-record or if he's not going to be pre-recording, how much access he has to resources that he can edit, insert, and change it to his slides. You know, change it between him and the slides and so forth. And I think, you know, that definitely varies from speaker to speaker. You know, 2 years of pandemia have taught us a lot of stuff. 2 years of pandemic have taught us, you know, how to edit the video, insert slides, and do all sorts of things. But still, you know, that's not exercise at a sufficient proficiency level by everybody, and you can expect that that some of the lectures are going to be under par for on that regard. We
Paulo, you're muted.
record, we ask, we edit people's videos, and but there are so many unpredictable things. There are so many stuff that's out of your control, which can turn a lecture into something which is less than ideal. And because in TUG we have small numbers, then we can deal with that. I believe that the IMU and the organization of the ICM themselves are going to be able to put that much attention on very few lectures, like say the lectures of the Fields medalists, the lecture about the work of the Fields medalists, the invited speakers. But in general, there are, hundreds, if not thousands of lectures at an ICM. So.
That's very interesting, and I've learned a lot. It's certainly going to be challenging. And there have been many opportunities afterwards to learn from what went well and what didn't go so well. I wonder if anybody else would like to comment on this.
One issue that hasn't come up is what we experienced with the TUG meetings the last 2 years that have been virtual. And that is that because TUG is a very international organization, we have people on every continent and in every time zone. And this meant that we essentially had a rolling conference that went on not quite 24 hours a day, because there were arranged breaks of a few hours, but nevertheless, it did mean that if you were in North America, there were talks being given in Europe that were just in the middle of your night. And unless you could stay up for 3 days in a row, you just couldn't see. And I'm sure ICM is going to have exactly the same issue. It's kind of frustrating. There were certainly talks that I wanted to hear, but I couldn't stay awake long enough. And my schedule is busy enough that I couldn't see them after the fact, but I could read the papers.
Yeah. And the care that it needs to be put in the planning is it has to be detailed work. To give an example of TUG, we have a prompter for the lectures, so somebody that is going to give a talk at 2 o'clock London time, he gets pinged 2 hours before the time on his cell phone or on email, and is given a button to say, yes, I'm aware that I'm going to be live in 2 hours. And then he's reminded again in an hour, and then he's reminded again in 30 minutes, in 15 minutes, and all the way to like a minute before it's time for him to be up in his place and to give the lecture. And we did use it 2 years ago, and we had 0 people missing a lecture. We didn't use it last year. It was sort of taught, the thought at the time it was not necessary. 4 people missed their lectures. And so I think the same kind of stuff would have to be developed for the ICM. And we are devising a few of the satellite meetings, but we haven't delved into the ICM infrastructure yet, and telling people, when a lecture is supposed to be held, in their location where they are, is extremely important and also extremely hard. You have people that move in between time zones and a half. India has 30 minutes difference between time zones, and they don't change their time zones in their laptop, so it's almost impossible to get information using JavaScript from their browsers about where they are and what the time is at the place where they are. So to have this system of information that is able to tell them, when a lecture is happening at their time zone and all that kind of stuff, when are they coming online, when, if they don't have a pre-recorded and they're supposed to be live or they're supposed to be in the question and answering session, that is extremely hard to keep a tight lead on it. If we had a smaller set of people that have been trained, would be easier. But I imagine that with the ICM, those talks will have to go 24 hours a day, round the clock, and there will be several different administrators dealing with it, which is going to be making it harder to make it uniform.
So is it fair to say that I didn't realize that the ICM would be such a big virtual event, and I think in part because COVID is over, so to speak. So it was sort of organized as a big conference, and then the war came along and had to immediately go virtual, and then you get double the or triple the attendance because of the whole world of mathematicians is interested. So I suspect that scaling is the biggest problem you've got. That providing a decent experience for several thousand people online is going to be an interesting challenge.
Yeah, surely is. I mean, the model is pretty much going to be, watching over YouTube and not participating on any interaction whatsoever, because Zoom is not able to scale into that large session. And so I would imagine that only, the speaker and a few other people commenting the lectures will be live on Zoom. And sort of the introducer of the speaker and a few other people commenting the session, but that most of the viewership would be on YouTube.
I've got a crazy idea, which is one of the world's biggest broadcast events is the US football Super Bowl. And people in the United States hold Super Bowl parties. And in this country, when there's big football matches, all the pubs have big screens showing the football, and you don't go to the match because you can't, but you gather and watch it with your mates. Now, some sort of informal online gatherings, completely independent from the ICM, but taking place at the same time, where algebraic geometers might get is sort of. I like the experience of being in the audience of a lecture, and that might be possible. That might be possible.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Yeah, the first ICM that was broadcast, it was many years ago. I think was the one in Barcelona, and we did have watching parties for it in Berkeley.
Oh, there we go.
And some of those parties, some of those parties started inside my office because I had the particular client that was used in order to broadcast the meeting at that time. And then later we moved to a bigger room, and then later we moved to a projecting room. It will be very interesting, but it will be also very challenging.
So I think I've answered my own question, which is, I mean, my nearest university is the Open University where I used to work, and it's 15 minutes walk away. And perhaps during the ICM, we should have some parties. Well, you know, we won't have a seminar talk, we'll have an ICM talk.
I didn't hear you very well, Jonathan.
Okay, so the Open University, for example, has got a strong interest in medical statistics, epidemiology. And if there's interesting talk at the ICM, why don't we just gather together physically to watch that talk?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it, you know, the reasons for us to be apart, you know, due to the pandemic are sort of dwindling. And according to the specialists in London, it will probably be over by July. Here in Berkeley, we're already having full meetings in person, full classes in person. So I think that, you know, viewing parties will be probably the norm.
Yeah, the ICM was going to be in person, and if it hadn't have been for the invasion of the Ukraine, it would have taken place with all those people together in St. Petersburg. So, as you say, that's not the problem. Right. I've noticed that we've sort of gone a bit over time. Anybody that wants to leave now is free to leave, and anybody that wants to stay is welcome to stay. Abbas, if you put your email address in the chat, I'll make sure you're put into contact with everybody and everybody's put into contact with you, because we'd love to keep in touch with you. So I think we have two special guests today, Abbas and Paulo. So thank you both very much. And anybody that wants to stay can stay, and anybody that has to go can go. And I'm grateful to Philip and Kelly for coming along as well. And thank you, Nelson.
I have a suggestion to make, if you wanted to listen to it.
Questions are allowed.
Yeah, well, my suggestion is that that you make a day for a publisher's interest, you know, a publisher corner of the Tech Hour. I picked up on that because I saw I can't quite make this time, because I have to adjust my personal time before I can start attending the Tech Hour on a regular basis, because we have meetings here in Berkeley exactly at the same time. And but what I'd like to suggest is that listening to the video of 2 weeks ago, I guess, with the developer of Latex ML, I saw there was a chap that came in. I don't remember his name, and he talked about editing for a particular mathematical analysis journal, and there is so much into that. I mean, we can make like probably 2 or 3 sessions discussing, you know, the publisher's side of tech. And I'd like to plant that seed on your head and let it grow a little bit.
I think that's a brilliant idea. And if I had all the contacts that I used to have, I might be the right person to do it. But I think once a month, a meeting of special interest for publishers would not be a bad thing. It doesn't have to be absolutely every month.
Yeah.
6 or 8 times a year, a meeting of special interest for publishers. And one of the previous Tech Hours, I made a note that small journal publishers will sort of have this sort of commonality. So I'm very happy to work with other people, such as yourself, Paulo, to do something like that. Even if what you're mainly doing is providing the contacts in the introductions. And I'm very happy to change the time so that it's other people. Does that give you
I'm changing my time.
Is that what you want?
Yeah. Yep. Yes. No. I mean, we should talk more, and but I'm changing my time, and so that I can attend more.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to be at the talk with with the people at Latex ML, and I wasn't able to do it.
We do have this big problem with time, and I had an email from Jonathan Godfrey saying, well, I'm in New Zealand and I'd like to come, but I can't get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. But having a regular meeting of interested publishers, I think is really good. Can I say I've just noticed something, which is the ICM is followed by the TUG meeting. The TUG meeting is about 10 days after. It would be great if you could lead a session on what we learned at the ICM.
Yeah, that's probably a cool thing. Yes.
Yeah, that would be really good. My particular interest at the TUG meeting is having a series of talks along the theme of towards accessible LaTeX, and the issue we've had about tables today would be in that whole area. You didn't get a chance properly to meet Abbas, who's a very interesting chap who seems to have a lot of energy and is interested in practical accessibility. So Abbas, your opportunity to speak to Paulo for a little bit. Paulo's at Berkeley, by the way, and Abbas is in Chicago.
Hi, lovely to meet you. And yeah, as Jonathan was saying earlier, I've really just been trying to collect all the different efforts I've noticed in just making math accessible. And I'm coming into it from a perspective of my colleagues being able to author something that's sort of universal. So right now, everybody either uses tech or math type or something, and they'll make their materials. And then if the student needs accommodations, they will go to the proper office. And then the accommodations office usually has an expert that finds a way to translate these materials for the student. And I'm not trying to remove that, but I'm trying to streamline it so that teachers who are incorporating things, especially into online LMSs, virtual conferences, and you're trying to convey slideshows and whatnot in a mathematical form, you have a streamlined way to do it so that we're not doing a ton of extra work, and just me trying to port some basic documents I was like, oh, wow, this is taking so much time that anybody that's teaching full-time or part-time or anything, there's no way that they're going to have time to just learn all this stuff in the course of all their. So if we have something that's somewhat similar to that isn't too much more complicated than learning how to use LaTeX, that can generate something that's going to be screen readable and quite robust, then that removes one layer of it. And then if the student still needs any additional, accommodations, they can do that without too much of a hurdle, because I think right now there's just too much of a gap. So, and I noticed AMS has some of their journals already. You can read them online, and they're existing, but not all of them. So I know that there's efforts on the way, and I don't know did you guys see the more recent, I think it's the Latex ML group that's working on porting the entire archive.
Yeah, we had a talk about that a couple of weeks ago. Bruce Miller and that's really interesting, and I'd be very, very interested to know to what degree it solves the accessibility problems of, for example, blind programmers who perhaps need to read an article about machine learning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And I could interject something here related to this. I received email this morning from ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, the professional organization of worldwide computer scientists. They have decided to make their entire archive from the first 50 years, which is roughly 1950 to 2000, freely accessible online for the entire world. And I think that's a significant development.
Oh, wow.
Perhaps other professional societies will follow suit. Because I think that the reality is, for most publishers, there isn't much revenue to be gained from a 50-year-old paper. There may be exceptions, of course, but routine papers that are that old usually don't get a lot of reading. And the commercial publishers like Springer and Elsevier, they tend to want $30 to $50 for a copy of an article in one of their journals, no matter how old it is. But I haven't heard any rumblings from any of them about making old content available. But certainly the professional societies that really exist to serve their membership rather than to make a large profit have this possibility. And we might hope that this would spread to chemistry, physics, biology, and mathematics as well, where there also are big societies that publish a lot of journals and have electronic content going back a long ways.
There are so many aspects of what tech is involved in. So many. I mean,
Yeah.
the archival nature is, I think, unique and extremely powerful and important, which is one of the topics we never got to, because I never got to show you my RAM disk. And I can install Tech Live in 9 minutes because I do it all to and from a RAM disk. And it takes 3 seconds, I think, to copy the whole installation. But that's me boasting on my computer. No, there's so many things that we need to address, or that we can address, ranging from accessibility to archivalness to the author experience, the publisher experience, the reader experience. I was prompted to look at the Hint software from Martin Ruckert, which is on the Tech Live. And that, I think, is actually really quite important as well. It opens up a lot of possibilities.